I looked my brother dead in the eye and whispered, "I am only paying for my glass of tap water." He invited me out to bury the hatchet, only to ambush me with an $8,000 banquet bill. To him, I wasn't family. I was just a walking wallet. Have you ever tried to forgive someone you love, only to realize they haven't changed at all? It is a heartbreaking realization.
Tell me how you handled it in the comments below, and please subscribe to hear my full story. But to understand how a simple family dinner turned into the ultimate test of my self-respect, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the text message that started it all.
5 years is a long time to erase someone from your life. When my phone buzzed with a text from David, my older brother, my heart physically ached. Getting married. Rehearsal dinner this Friday at the Grand Orchid. Let's bury the hatchet, Sarah, please. For half a decade, we hadn't spoken.
The silence began after our father passed away, when David sold the family home without consulting me, leaving me scrambling to find a place to live while finishing my degree. I spent years rebuilding my life, healing from the emotional neglect, and convincing myself I didn't need a brother who viewed me as a burden. Yet, staring at that message, a foolish, fragile part of me hoped for reconciliation. Maybe he had changed. Maybe love was stronger than past betrayals. I wore my best dress, clutching a carefully wrapped gift, a beautiful crystal vase, and walked into the elegant lobby of the Grand Orchid. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow, and soft jazz played in the background. My hands were shaking. I had spent hours practicing what I would say, how I would smile, and how I would gently navigate the awkwardness of seeing him again. I wanted my family back. I wanted the brother who used to read me bedtime stories, not the stranger who locked me out of my childhood home. As the hostess guided me toward the private dining suites, my anxiety spiked. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my skirt. This is a fresh start, I told myself. Leave the past in the past. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, expecting a small, intimate gathering, a quiet table where David and his fiancée could sit with me and finally talk. Instead, the sight before me made my blood run cold. The private dining room was overflowing. It wasn't an intimate gathering, it was a full-blown banquet. 20 people sat around a massive mahogany table adorned with towering floral centerpieces. I recognized David's fiancée, Jessica, laughing loudly at the head of the table. Surrounding them were her parents, bridesmaids, groomsmen, and people I had never seen before in my life. The table was practically groaning under the weight of luxury. Silver buckets held bottles of vintage Dom Perignon. Delicate ice sculptures chilled trays of premium beluga caviar. At every single place setting rested a custom velvet-wrapped party favor. David spotted me hovering near the doorway. He didn't look remorseful or hesitant. Instead, he flashed a wide, charismatic smile, the same smile he used when he was about to get his way. "Sarah, you made it," he announced, drawing the attention of the entire room. He jogged over, wrapping me in a suffocating, theatrical hug. He smelled of expensive cologne and champagne. Before I could even murmur a greeting, he leaned in, his grip tightening painfully on my shoulder. His voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial whisper, masked by his broad smile. "So glad you're here, sis. Look, I told everyone my wealthy little sister was hosting tonight to welcome Jessica to the family. You're covering this as your wedding gift, right? Don't make a scene." He patted my back firmly and stepped away, raising his glass to the room. "A toast to my amazing sister, Sarah." The room erupted in polite applause. I stood frozen. The warmth in my chest, the fragile hope I had nurtured for 5 years, shattered into dust. I wasn't here for an apology. I was a walking wallet. The emotional manipulation was so staggering I could hardly breathe. The applause faded, leaving an expectant hum in the room. 20 pairs of eyes looked at me, raising their crystal flutes. Jessica blew me an air kiss across the room. David stood beside me, his eyes hard and challenging, daring me to embarrass him in front of his new, affluent in-laws. For a split second, the old Sarah, the younger sister who always shrank to avoid conflict, who took the blame to keep the peace, wanted to pull out her credit card and cry in the bathroom. The bill for this room alone would drain my emergency savings. But 5 years of independence had forged a spine he didn't know I had. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I maintained a serene, polite smile. I caught the eye of the banquet manager, a polished man in a tailored suit, standing discreetly near the service doors. I gave him a subtle nod, and he glided over immediately. "Is everything to your liking, ma'am?" he asked softly. I leaned in, my voice calm and perfectly steady. I whispered just 2 sentences into his ear. "I am not part of this party, and I will only be paying for a glass of tap water. The gentleman who just toasted is solely responsible for the entire bill." The manager's eyes flicked to David, then back to me. A look of professional understanding washed over his face. He offered a slight, knowing smile. "Right away, ma'am. I will bring your water, and I will present the final check to the groom immediately." I nodded my thanks. Turning back to David, I kept my smile radiant. He looked smug, assuming I had just ordered another round of champagne. He had no idea the avalanche that was about to hit him. I took the only empty seat available, located at the far end of the table. The conversation around me resumed, filled with boastful chatter about exotic honeymoons and designer wedding gowns. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. A server approached, quietly placing a single glass of iced tap water in front of me. I took a slow sip. 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The main course plates had been cleared, and people were eagerly anticipating dessert. That was when the banquet manager returned. He didn't approach discreetly this time. He walked with purpose directly to the head of the table, holding a sleek black leather checkbook. He placed it gently but firmly right next to David's half-empty caviar plate. "Sir, as per the venue's policy for parties of 20 or more, we require the final settlement before dessert is served," the manager announced, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet room. David laughed nervously, waving a hand in my direction. "Oh no, you need to give that to my sister, Sarah. She's the one hosting tonight." The manager didn't blink. He stood tall, exuding an aura of absolute authority. "I have already spoken with the lady, sir. She has informed me that she is not hosting this event and is only responsible for her glass of water. As you made the reservation under your name and ordered the menu, the total balance of $8,450 is your responsibility." "How would you like to pay?" A suffocating silence blanketed the room. Jessica's fork dropped with a loud clatter against her porcelain plate. Her father, a stern-looking man, narrowed his eyes at David. The color rapidly drained from my brother's face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale. "What? No, that's a misunderstanding," David stammered, his confident facade crumbling instantly. He shot a desperate, furious glare down the table at me. "Sarah, tell him you're paying for this." I didn't break eye contact. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke clearly enough for his future in-laws to hear every single word. "David, we haven't spoken in 5 years. You invited me here tonight saying you wanted to bury the hatchet. I thought you wanted your sister back. I didn't realize you just needed someone to foot the bill for an $8,000 dinner you couldn't afford." Jessica gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Her mother leaned over, whispering frantically to her husband. "You're ruining my wedding," David hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of panic and rage. "I'm doing nothing but drinking my water," I replied softly, the sadness in my chest finally outweighing the anger. "You ruined this the moment you decided my worth was tied to my bank account. I came here today ready to forgive you for everything, but you haven't changed at all." I stood up, pushing my chair back. The scraping sound echoed in the tense silence. I picked up my purse and the crystal vase I had wrapped with such care. I walked up to the head of the table, placing the wrapped box gently in front of Jessica. "Congratulations on your wedding," I told her sincerely. "I wish you the best of luck. You're going to need it." Without another word to my brother, I turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors. My heart broke all over again. But for the first time in 5 years, I finally felt completely, utterly free. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and unshed tears. By the time I unlocked my front door, my phone was vibrating violently in my purse. I dropped my keys on the counter and stared at the glowing screen. 30 missed calls, 50 text messages. They were mostly from David, a rapid-fire succession of rage and panic. "You humiliated me. Jessica's parents are furious. You owe me for this, Sarah." There were also messages from aunts and uncles who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly outraged that I had abandoned my brother on his special night. The smear campaign had already begun. He was spinning the narrative, painting me as the vindictive, selfish sister who crashed his party just to embarrass him. I didn't reply. I didn't block him either. I simply turned the phone on silent and walked to my kitchen to make a cup of chamomile tea. The old Sarah would have been composing a frantic, tear-soaked apology. She would have called the restaurant, begged for forgiveness, and taken out a loan just to restore the fragile illusion of family harmony. But as the hot water steeped the tea leaves, I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid of his anger anymore. The crushing guilt that had governed my life for 5 years was entirely gone. He had orchestrated a cruel, manipulative trap, assuming my desperation for family would override my self-respect. He had gambled his reputation on my submission, and he had lost. As I sat on my sofa, sipping my tea in the quiet sanctuary of the home I had built for myself, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. The storm was raging outside my door, but for the very first time, it couldn't touch me. 3 days passed. The incessant calls eventually slowed to a trickle as family members realized I wasn't going to engage in their drama. I went to work, I tended to my garden, and I breathed easier than I had in years. The quiet was broken on a Tuesday evening by a hesitant knock on my front door. I checked the peephole, half expecting David to be standing there with a rehearsed speech and clenched fists. Instead, I saw Jessica. She stood alone on my porch, looking exhausted. The radiant, laughing bride-to-be from the restaurant was gone. She wore a simple sweater, her eyes red-rimmed and lacking makeup. I unlocked the door, keeping the chain fastened. "Jessica, what do you want?" "Please, Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can we just talk? 5 minutes. I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea what he was doing." I studied her face. There was a desperate sincerity in her eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there at the rehearsal dinner. Slowly, I unhooked the chain and swung the door open, gesturing for her to come inside. I led her to the living room, offering her a seat. She sank into the armchair, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. "David told me you were a successful tech executive," she began, her voice trembling. "He said you felt terrible about missing out on our lives and insisted on hosting the dinner as a grand gesture of reconciliation. He even showed me text messages, fake ones, I realize now, where you supposedly picked out the menu." I closed my eyes, the sheer magnitude of his deceit washing over me. He hadn't just manipulated me, he had completely fabricated a reality to impress her. "I'm an accountant, Jessica," I said gently, watching the shock ripple across her face. "I make a decent living, but I certainly don't have $8,000 to drop on caviar and vintage champagne. We haven't spoken since my father died, when David sold our family home and kept the majority of the equity for himself." Tears spilled over her eyelashes, silently tracking down her pale cheeks. She opened her purse and pulled out a thick, crumpled stack of papers. "My father demanded to see David's financials after the restaurant incident.
When the manager handed him that bill, David didn't have a single credit card that wasn't declined. My dad ended up paying for the dinner just to let us leave the building. Yesterday, we forced David to show us everything. She pushed the papers across the coffee table toward me. I didn't need to look closely to recognize past due notices, maxed out credit card statements, and loan defaults. "He's completely broke, Sarah," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "He's been lying to me since the day we met. He told me he was a partner at his firm. He told me he owned his condo. It's all leased, all borrowed. He was relying on my parents to pay for the wedding, and he was using you to cover his tracks for the rehearsal." I felt a heavy, sorrowful ache in my chest, not for David, but for the brokenness of it all. "What are you going to do?" I asked softly. She wiped her eyes, her posture straightening slightly as a newfound resolve settled over her. "The wedding is off. I packed my things this morning. I needed to apologize to you. I'm so sorry." The news of the canceled wedding spread through our extended family like a wildfire. The aunts and uncles who had berated me via text message were suddenly painfully silent. David's carefully constructed house of cards had completely collapsed, and the truth of his financial bankruptcy was laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't feel victorious. There was no joy in watching my brother's life fall apart, only a profound, lingering sadness for the boy he used to be before greed and ego consumed him. A week later, I received a phone call. The caller ID flashed David's name. For a long moment, I debated ignoring it. Finally, I answered, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Sarah," his voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual arrogance and bravado. He sounded broken. "I hit rock bottom. Jessica left me. I have to move out of the condo. I finally see what I've done. To her, to our father's memory, and to you." I listened to the sound of his quiet, ragged sobbing over the line. "I was so incredibly angry, David," I whispered. "You sold our family house. You took my security." "I know," he choked out, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I was selfish. I was terrified of being a failure, so I stole your future to build a fake life for myself. I am so deeply sorry, Sarah. I don't expect you to ever forgive me, but I needed to say it." It was the first truly honest thing he had said in 5 years. The thick ice around my heart, hardened by years of emotional neglect and bitter resentment, finally began to crack. "Where are you right now?" I asked softly. "I'm at a cheap motel just outside the city," David replied, his voice trembling. "I'm starting over. I just got a job at a hardware store. It's not much, but it's honest." I closed my eyes, picturing my older brother, the man who once demanded vintage champagne, now humbled and wearing a hardware store uniform. The profound shift in his reality was exactly what he needed. "David," I said gently, "being family doesn't mean I will ever let you use me again. The financial manipulation and the lies are unforgivable if they continue, but I don't want to live the rest of my life without my brother. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Sarah. I promise," he wept. "You can start by paying me back for the house, even if it's $20 a month," I told him, drawing a firm but loving boundary. "And we can start seeing each other. Just coffee, once a week. We take it slow." "Thank you," he breathed out, sounding like a drowning man who had just been thrown a lifeline. "Thank you, Sarah." I hung up the phone and walked into my dining room. The crystal vase I had bought for his wedding still sat on the table. It wasn't a symbol of a fake, opulent life anymore. I went to my garden, cut a fresh, vibrant bouquet of hydrangeas, and arranged them beautifully in the crystal. The water was perfectly clear. For the first time in 5 years, the heavy burden of family conflict was gone. We had a long, difficult road ahead of us to rebuild the trust, but the hatchet was finally, truly buried. We were finally going to heal. The diner down the street from my apartment was a far cry from the Grand Orchid. The booths were upholstered in faded red vinyl, and the air smelled heavily of fried bacon and strong black coffee. I sat in the corner booth, nervously running my thumb over the rim of my ceramic mug. When the bell above the door chimed, I looked up. David walked in. The physical transformation was jarring. Gone were the tailored Italian suits and the expensive, perfectly coiffed hair. He wore a faded flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, and a pair of scuffed work boots. The arrogant swagger that used to define his every step had vanished, replaced by a hesitant, almost cautious posture. He spotted me and offered a tight, nervous smile, sliding into the booth across from me. He didn't complain about the sticky table or the chipped sugar dispenser. He just folded his hands in his lap, looking entirely out of place, yet completely grounded. "Thank you for meeting me, Sarah," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. There was a raw vulnerability there that I hadn't seen since we were children. "You're on time," I noted, a small, genuine observation. In his past life, David was always notoriously late, believing his time was inherently more valuable than anyone else's. "I can't afford to be late anymore," he admitted, a self-deprecating chuckle escaping his lips. "To work or to this?" The waitress came by and he ordered a plain black coffee. We sat in a surprisingly comfortable silence for a few moments. It was incredibly awkward, trying to find a starting line for two people who shared a lifetime of history but hadn't truly known each other in over 5 years. But as he blew on his hot coffee, the tension in my chest eased. This wasn't the man who tried to extort me. This was just my big brother, starting over from zero. We spent the first few weeks of our coffee meetings keeping the conversation safely on the surface. We talked about the weather, my garden, and the mundane details of his new job stocking shelves at the hardware store. Neither of us dared to touch the deep, gaping wounds of the past yet. We were walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong word would shatter this fragile truce. During our 4th meeting, as I reached into my purse to leave a tip for the waitress, David suddenly placed his hand over mine. "Wait," he said quietly. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a crisp, meticulously folded $20 bill. He smoothed it out on the scratched Formica table and slid it across to me. "It's not much," he said, his cheeks flushing a deep shade of crimson. "But I got my first paycheck yesterday. I calculated my rent at the motel, my groceries, and my bus fare. This is what I have left over. It's the first installment for the house, Sarah." I stared at the green paper, my throat suddenly tight. $20 was a drop in the ocean compared to the equity he had stolen from me 5 years ago. It wouldn't pay my mortgage or change my life, but looking at his calloused hands and the profound shame in his eyes, I realized this $20 bill cost him everything. It was his pride, his comfort, and his sincere attempt at restitution. I didn't brush it off or tell him to keep it. Diminishing his effort would have ruined the moment. Instead, I carefully picked up the bill, folded it, and placed it securely in my wallet. "Thank you, David," I said gently, my voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate it, truly." For the first time, he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Rebuilding my relationship with David was a private, delicate process, but our extended family didn't see it that way. The shockwaves of his canceled wedding and financial ruin were still rippling through the family grapevine. One Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Aunt Clara. She was one of the loudest voices who had condemned me for abandoning David at the rehearsal dinner. I took a deep breath and answered, "Sarah, darling." Her voice was dripping with a forced, sugary sweetness that instantly put me on edge. "I was just thinking about you. We are all so terribly worried about your brother. Have you spoken to him? I hear he's living in absolute squalor." "David and I are in touch, Aunt Clara," I replied evenly, refusing to give her the gossip she was so clearly fishing for. "Well, you need to step in, sweetheart," she insisted, her tone shifting to a commanding lecture.
You're doing so well for yourself. You can't let him live in a motel. You need to let him move into your spare room until he gets back on his feet.
Family takes care of family, Sarah. My grip on the phone tightened. The absolute audacity of her request left me breathless. Aunt Clara, I said, my voice dropping to a firm, icy calm. Where was this lecture about family when David sold my childhood home out from under me? Where were you when I was sleeping on my friend's couch to finish my degree? Silence stretched over the line.
David is taking responsibility for his own life, and I am supporting him emotionally, I continued, establishing a boundary made of steel. But I will not be his financial safety net, and I won't be guilt-tripped by people who only care when it's convenient. Goodbye, Aunt Clara. I hung up, my hands shaking slightly, but my heart felt incredibly light. The transition from a high-flying, supposed executive to a retail worker was not a smooth one for David. The humiliation of his fall from grace frequently threatened to overwhelm him. One Tuesday evening, he called me outside of our usual coffee schedule. The moment I answered, I could hear the sharp, defensive edge in his voice, a ghost of his old arrogance. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he spat out, the background noise indicating he was walking down a busy street. "A customer today spent 20 minutes screaming at me because I couldn't find the exact shade of brass screws he wanted. He called me an incompetent idiot. Me! Do you know how many people I used to manage? I used to wear suits that cost more than that guy makes in a month." I closed my eyes, listening to his heavy, frustrated breathing. The old David would have lashed out, quit the job, and blamed the world for his misfortune. This was a critical test of his character. "You aren't that guy in the expensive suit anymore, David," I reminded him softly but firmly. "That guy built a life on lies. This job is honest. You are earning every single cent you make." "It's just so humiliating," his voice cracked, the anger dissolving into a deep, hollow despair. "I'm 32 years old, Sarah. I have nothing. I am nobody." "You are my brother," I countered instantly, refusing to let him wallow in self-pity. "And for the first time in 5 years, I am actually proud of you. Don't let your bruised ego drag you back to the person you used to be. You are stronger than a rude customer looking for screws." He was quiet for a long time. The traffic hummed in the background. "You're right," he whispered finally, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "I'm sorry. I needed to hear your voice." Despite my firm boundary regarding financial assistance, I couldn't ignore the reality of David's living situation. A weekly coffee meeting allowed me to check in, but it didn't fill his refrigerator. He was looking thinner, his cheekbones sharper than I remembered. He never asked for help, which only made me want to offer it more. I found a loophole in my own rules. I wouldn't give him cash, but I wouldn't let him starve either. Every Sunday, I spent my afternoon cooking in bulk: hearty beef stews, baked ziti, roasted vegetables, and chicken casseroles. I divided them into neat, individual Tupperware containers. On Monday evenings, after my work, I would drive out to the rundown motel on the edge of the city. His room was painfully small. Just a bed, a dresser, and a mini fridge that hummed loudly in the corner. But it was surprisingly clean, his few belongings folded neatly. When I showed up the first time with a grocery bag full of meals, he looked utterly devastated, as if my charity was a spotlight on his failure. "I'm not doing this because you're helpless, David," I told him, stacking the containers into his tiny fridge before he could protest. "I'm doing this because I made too much food, and I hate leftovers. Besides, you need to save your money for an actual apartment. Eating instant noodles every night isn't going to help you focus at work." He stood by the door, watching me with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and deep shame. When I finished, I turned to leave. He pulled me into a sudden, tight hug. He smelled like sawdust and cheap soak, a far cry from his old designer cologne. "Thank you," he murmured into my hair. "I promise I'll give the containers back washed." "You better," I smiled, squeezing him back. 4 months into our new dynamic, David and I decided to go to the local supermarket together. It was a mundane Sunday errand, a normal sibling activity we hadn't shared since we were teenagers. We were in the produce aisle, debating the merits of different apples, when the past abruptly collided with the present. "David! David Miller, is that you?" A booming, jovial voice echoed down the aisle.
We both turned. Approaching us was a man in a pristine polo shirt and a cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders. I instantly recognized him as Marcus, one of the groomsmen from the disastrous rehearsal dinner. He was part of David's old country club circle, a man born into the wealth David had so desperately tried to fake. I felt David instantly tense beside me. His hand gripped the shopping cart so hard his knuckles turned white. Panic flashed across his face. The instinct to lie, to invent a glamorous excuse for his faded clothes and budget groceries, was written all over his expression. I held my breath, waiting to see which version of my brother would speak. "Marcus," David said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's been a while."
Marcus looked David up and down, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "It certainly has. Heard things went south with Jessica. Shame. So what are you doing these days? Still at the firm?" David didn't flinch. He didn't look at me for help. He stood tall, looking Marcus directly in the eye. "No, I left the firm. I'm actually working out at Miller's Hardware on 5th Street now."
Trying to build something honest from the ground up. Marcus's smirk vanished, replaced by awkward confusion. "Oh, hardware, right. Well, good seeing you." He quickly hurried away. David let out a massive breath, his shoulders dropping. I reached out and squeezed his arm. He had passed the hardest test of all. Being David's emotional anchor was healing, but it was also incredibly exhausting. As the months passed, the reality of my role began to weigh heavily on my shoulders. I was the one he called when he had a bad day, the one he leaned on when the depression of his situation crept in. I loved having my brother back, but sometimes the quiet, peaceful life I had built for myself felt overshadowed by his constant need for reassurance. One Friday night, after a particularly draining week at my own job, David called me in a panic because his bus pass had expired and he was short on rent. I sat on my living room floor, my back against the sofa, feeling tears of pure exhaustion prick my eyes. I didn't want to be the strong sister tonight. I just wanted someone to ask me how my day was. "Sarah, are you there?" he asked, sensing my silence over the phone. "I'm here, David," I whispered, rubbing my temples. I'm really tired today. Work was brutal, and my car needs new brakes, and I just feel completely overwhelmed." There was a pause on the line. The old David would have ignored my stress and brought the conversation immediately back to his own crisis. Instead, his tone shifted entirely. The frantic anxiety vanished, replaced by a calm, protective warmth I hadn't heard in years. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said gently. "I'm being selfish again. Listen to me. Turn off your phone, take a hot bath. Do not worry about my rent or my bus pass. I will figure it out. I am the big brother, remember? Let me be the big brother tonight. You just rest." Tears finally spilled over my cheeks, but they were tears of profound relief. He was finally learning to carry his own weight. Winter arrived, bringing a bitter chill that made David's motel room drafty and uncomfortable. Despite the hardships, he was saving every penny he could. He had even secured a small promotion to floor manager at the hardware store. To celebrate, I invited him over for dinner at my place. When he arrived, he wasn't carrying a bottle of cheap wine or dessert. He was carrying a battered, dust-covered cardboard box. "I went to the storage unit today," he explained, setting the box down on my living room rug. "I'm clearing it out to save on the monthly fee. But I found this. I couldn't throw it away, and I couldn't look inside alone." I knelt beside him, my heart skipping a beat. Written on the side of the box in faded black marker was, "Dad's desk." After our father passed,
David had aggressively cleared out the house to sell it, boxing everything up before I even had a chance to grieve. I had assumed all these personal items were lost forever to the landfill. With shaking hands, I opened the flaps. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco immediately wafted out, hitting me with a wave of intense nostalgia. Inside were the mundane but precious artifacts of our father's life. His reading glasses, a stack of worn crossword puzzles, his favorite fountain pen, and his silver pocket watch. I picked up the heavy silver watch, tracing the engraved initials on the back. A sob ripped from my throat, raw and sudden. For 5 years, I had suppressed the grief of losing my father because the betrayal of losing my brother had overshadowed it. Now, sitting on the floor with David beside me, the dam finally broke. I cried for our dad, for the years we lost, and for the family that was broken. David didn't try to stop me from crying. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat beside me on the rug, his own face wet with tears, and pulled me into a fierce, protective embrace. We sat there for a long time, clutching our father's belongings, mourning the man we loved and the siblings we used to be. "I was so scared, Sarah," David whispered finally, his voice thick and broken. He kept his gaze fixed on our father's reading glasses. When Dad got sick, and then when he died, I was terrified. He was our anchor. Without him, I felt like a child playing dress-up in an adult's world. I listened quietly, realizing this was the core of everything. This was the truth beneath the arrogance. "I thought if I had money, if I looked successful, it would fix the hole he left," David continued, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. "I sold the house because I couldn't stand walking past his empty chair. I pushed you away because looking at you reminded me of how badly I was failing at being the man he raised me to be. I traded our family for an illusion because the reality of his death was too painful. You didn't have to carry it alone," I told him, resting my head against his shoulder. "I was grieving too. We could have leaned on each other." "I know that now," he said, gently taking the silver pocket watch from my hands and pressing it firmly into my palm. "Keep it. He would have wanted you to have it." "I'm so sorry I robbed us of the chance to mourn him together. That night, we didn't just bury the hatchet between us. We finally laid our father's memory to rest with honor and love." 6 months after the disastrous rehearsal dinner, David handed me a different kind of envelope during our weekly coffee meetup. I opened it, expecting his usual $20 repayment. Instead, a shiny brass key fell out onto the table. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with surprise. He was beaming, radiating a quiet, grounded pride that looked better on him than any tailored suit ever did. "I signed the lease yesterday," he announced. "It's a tiny studio apartment above a bakery on 8th Street. It's nothing fancy. The plumbing groans and the floors creak, but it's mine. I paid the deposit with my own money. No credit cards, no loans." A massive, uncontrollable smile spread across my face. I reached across the table and grabbed his hands. "David, that's incredible. I am so incredibly proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah," he said earnestly. "You didn't give me a dime, but you gave me the one thing I actually needed. You gave me a reason to be a better man." That weekend, I arrived at his new apartment armed with paint rollers, drop cloths, and 2 large pizzas. The studio was exactly as he described, small, drafty, and smelling faintly of fresh bread from the bakery below. But as we spent the afternoon painting the faded walls a bright, clean white, laughing as we accidentally splattered paint on each other's hair, it felt like a palace. He had lost his fake empire, his wealthy fiancée, and his superficial friends. But standing in that tiny, paint-splattered room, eating pizza on the floor with my brother, I knew we had both gained something infinitely more valuable. We had found our way back home. Our first holiday season together in 5 years arrived accompanied by a relentless, drumming autumn rain. Thanksgiving had always been our father's favorite holiday, and avoiding the grief of it had been my tradition since his passing. This year, however, David invited me to a small apartment. When I arrived, the studio was filled with the savory scent of roasted chicken. He couldn't afford a turkey, but he had spent hours perfecting his mother's herb rub. I sat by the single large window, watching the heavy rain blur the city streetlights. The rhythmic sound of water hitting the glass was incredibly soothing, washing away the lingering anxieties of the past year. David set 2 mismatched plates on a small folding table. He didn't apologize for the lack of fine china or the cramped space. "It smells amazing," I told him, turning away from the rain-streaked window. "I burned the first batch of stuffing," he confessed with a sheepish grin, pulling out a chair for me. "But I managed to save the potatoes." We sat down, and for a moment, the only sound was the comforting patter of the storm outside. David reached across the table, his rough, calloused hand gently taking mine. "I'm thankful for you, Sarah, more than I could ever express in words. You didn't give up on me when you had every right to." Tears pricked my eyes. I squeezed his hand back, feeling the solid, honest weight of his grip. "I'm thankful you found your way back to me, David." We ate our humble meal to the sound of the rain, and for the first time since we lost our father, my heart felt completely, unconditionally full. A few weeks before the 1-year anniversary of the disastrous rehearsal dinner, David asked me to meet him at a small cafe near his work. When I sat down, he pushed a thick, crisp envelope across the table. I frowned, my heart doing a nervous flutter. "What is this?" I asked, hesitating to touch it. "Open it," he insisted softly. I pulled back the flap and gasped. Inside was a cashier's check made out to me for $15,000. I stared at the numbers, my mind racing. "David, where did you get this? Tell me you didn't take out a predatory loan." He shook his head immediately, anticipating my panic. "No loan, Sarah, I promise. Do you remember the vintage Rolex I used to wear? The one I told everyone was a bonus from my old firm?" I nodded slowly. I assumed it had been repossessed along with his car and his expensive suits. "It was the only thing I actually bought outright before things got bad," he explained, looking down at his coffee. "I kept it hidden when everything crashed. I told myself it was my emergency fund, my absolute last resort. But holding on to it felt like holding on to the lie, so I sold it to a collector." "The money isn't mine. It belongs to you. It's a lump sum toward the house equity I stole." I looked from the check to my brother. The watch had been his ultimate status symbol, his anchor to the wealthy persona he had crafted. Selling it wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a complete and utter surrender of his ego. I carefully folded the check into my wallet. "Thank you, David. I accept this." The $15,000 was a profound gesture, but there was still a lingering ghost between us, the actual house our father had built. One Saturday afternoon, I drove us to our old neighborhood. I didn't tell David where we were going until I parked the car across the street from the familiar 2-story brick home. He froze in the passenger seat. The color drained from his face as he stared at the front porch, where we used to spend our summers. A different family's cars were parked in the driveway, and a child's bicycle lay on the lawn. "Why did you bring us here, Sarah?" he asked, his voice tight with rising panic. "I can't look at it, please." "Because avoiding it gives it power over us," I replied gently, turning the engine off. "You sold the bricks and the wood, David, but you didn't sell our childhood. You didn't sell the memories of Dad teaching us to ride bikes on that driveway." He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling in his lap. "I threw away our sanctuary." "We are building a new one," I assured him, reaching over to grip his shoulder. "I needed you to see that the house is just a building. It's sheltering a new family now. Our family isn't confined to those 4 walls anymore. Our family is sitting right here in this car." He opened his eyes, taking a long, deep, shuddering breath. We sat in silence for 20 minutes, just watching the house. As we finally drove away, the heavy, suffocating guilt that had always clung to David seemed to lift, left behind on that familiar pavement.
The harsh winter hit the city with brutal force. A severe strain of the flu swept through my office, and despite my best efforts, I woke up one Tuesday with a raging fever, aching joints, and a throat like sandpaper. I barely managed to call in sick before collapsing back into bed, shivering violently beneath heavy blankets. Around noon, my phone rang. It was David. I let it go to voicemail, too weak to speak. 10 minutes later, I heard the jingle of my spare key in the front door lock. Footsteps hurried down the hallway, and David appeared in my bedroom doorway, still wearing his hardware store uniform. "You didn't answer your phone on your lunch break," he said, breathless and looking panicked. "Are you okay?"
"Flu," I croaked out, pulling the blanket up to my chin. "Go away, you'll catch it." "Not a chance," he declared firmly. He stripped off his work jacket and immediately went to the kitchen. I drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, comforted by the sounds of him moving around my apartment, water running, the kettle whistling, the clinking of mugs.
He returned with a tray holding hot tea, pain relievers, and a bowl of steaming chicken soup. He propped my pillows up and sat on the edge of the mattress, pressing a cool, damp washcloth to my burning forehead. "You left work for this?" I whispered, my eyes heavy. "I took a personal day," he replied gently, pulling the blankets snugly around my shoulders. "Rest, Sarah. I've got you." As I closed my eyes, I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't have to be the strong one. My big brother was finally back. For 3 days, David essentially moved into my apartment. He slept on the sofa, waking up every few hours to check my temperature and force me to drink water. He made sure I took my medication on schedule, and he even managed to keep my beloved indoor plants watered. On the 4th morning, my fever finally broke. I walked into the kitchen, wrapped in a thick robe, feeling incredibly weak but human again. David was at the stove, scrambling eggs. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a heavy stubble on his jaw, but he smiled warmly when he saw me standing there. "Look who survived," he teased, pulling out a chair for me. "I'm so sorry, David," I sighed, sinking into the seat. "I ruined your week. I know you need the hourly pay at the store." He stopped stirring the eggs and turned to face me, his expression entirely serious. "Sarah, stop. Do not apologize for being human. You spent the last year carrying me when I couldn't stand on my own 2 feet. Taking care of you when you're sick isn't a burden. It's a privilege. It's what family is supposed to do." He placed a plate of hot food in front of me. I looked down at the simple meal, overwhelmed by the profound shift in our dynamic. The selfish, arrogant man who once tried to extort me for a luxury dinner was entirely gone. In his place stood a man who willingly sacrificed his wages to wipe my feverish forehead. I ate the eggs quietly, wiping away a few stray, happy tears. My recovery was interrupted by an unexpected and entirely unwelcome visitor. I was resting on the sofa when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the apartment. David, who was wiping down the kitchen counters, went to answer it. I heard the door open, followed by a sharp intake of breath from the hallway. "David, look at you!" Aunt Clara's shrill voice pierced the quiet apartment.
"You look dreadful. I came to check on Sarah. I heard she was deathly ill." Aunt Clara marched into the living room, freezing when she saw David holding a dishcloth. She had spent the last year gossiping about his downfall, using his poverty as a cautionary tale at family gatherings. "I am taking care of her, Aunt Clara," David said, stepping between her and the sofa, subtly shielding me.
"Well, it's the least you could do after everything you've put her through," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "I hope you aren't living here, draining her resources again." I opened my mouth to defend him, but David raised a hand, stopping me. He stood tall, his posture projecting a quiet, unshakable dignity. "I have my own apartment, and I pay my own bills. I am here because my sister needed me.
Sarah and I have made our peace, Aunt Clara. If you cannot speak to me with respect in her home, then you need to leave. Aunt Clara gaped at him, utterly speechless. She had expected the cowering, shameful David she had heard rumors about. Instead, she faced a man who knew his worth. She huffed, turned on her heel, and marched out, slamming the door behind her.
David turned to me, offering a gentle smile. The protective boundary was finally complete. Winter deepened, blanketing the city in a thick layer of pristine white snow. The aesthetic of the world outside transformed into a quiet, looping canvas of falling flakes, beautifully illuminated by the street lamps. I invited David over for dinner to celebrate a milestone. It had been exactly 1 year since the rehearsal dinner. We didn't talk about Jessica, the canceled wedding, or the exorbitant restaurant bill. That night belonged to the past, locked away in a chapter we had both permanently closed. Instead, we stood by my living room window, holding mugs of hot cocoa, watching the silent, mesmerizing snowfall. I got called into the manager's office today, David said quietly, his breath fogging the cold glass. I turned to him, instantly concerned. Is everything okay? Did you get written up? He shook his head, a slow, incredibly proud smile spreading across his face. Mr. Miller is retiring at the end of the month. He offered me the position of general store manager, salaried, health benefits, the works. I gasped, throwing my arms around his neck, nearly spilling my cocoa. David! That is phenomenal. You earned every single bit of that. I told him I'd take it on one condition, he continued, hugging me back tightly. I told him I need every Sunday off, non-negotiable. Why? I asked, pulling back to look at him. Because Sundays are for having coffee with my sister, he stated matter-of-factly, as if it was a universal law of nature. And no job, no amount of money will ever be more important than that again. Looking out at the quiet, peaceful snow, I knew the turbulent storms of our past were truly over. We had weathered the absolute worst of it. With his new salary as general manager, David's financial situation stabilized drastically. He moved out of the tiny studio above the bakery and into a modest, comfortable one-bedroom apartment closer to my side of town. The transition was smooth, but he remained incredibly frugal, terrified of slipping back into the debt that had nearly ruined him. One Sunday, during our usual coffee date, he slid a small, leather-bound notebook across the table toward me. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with meticulously handwritten columns of numbers, dates, and calculations. It was a ledger. I've been tracking everything, David explained, tracing the edge of the notebook with his index finger. The original equity of the house, adjusted for what inflation would have been. I subtracted the $15,000 from the watch and the smaller payments I've made over the year. I looked at the final number at the bottom of the page. It was still a significant amount, but it was no longer an impossible mountain. With my new salary, I can pay you $1,000 a month, he stated firmly. It will take me about 3 more years, but I will clear this debt, Sarah. I swear it to you. I closed the leather book and handed it back to him. I know you will, David. I don't need the book to prove it. You've already proven that your word means something again. I need the book, he insisted softly, tucking it into his jacket pocket. It reminds me of the cost of my arrogance. It keeps me grounded. I never want to forget what it took to earn your forgiveness. I smiled, sipping my coffee. The ledger wasn't just about money anymore. It was a testament to his redemption. 3 years is both a fleeting moment and an eternity. Life settled into a beautiful, predictable rhythm. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and small victories together. We laughed often, and the heavy shadow of our father's death finally transformed from a source of grief into a shared well of loving memories. On a bright, crisp spring morning, 3 years after he handed me the ledger, David knocked on my door. He was dressed neatly, looking healthy, happy, and entirely at peace. He walked into my kitchen and handed me a single piece of paper.
It was a bank draft for the exact final amount written in his little leather book. I stared at the paper, a complex knot of emotions tightening my throat. "This is it," I whispered, looking up at him. "You're done." "I'm done," he agreed, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "The debt for the house is officially paid in full." I walked over to my kitchen counter, picked up a pen, and flipped the bank draft over. I didn't endorse it. Instead, I wrote, "Paid in full with love," signed my name, and handed it back to him. "Sarah, what are you doing?"
"That's your money," he protested, trying to push it back into my hands. "I don't want the money, David. Put it toward a down payment on a house of your own," I told him, stepping back and crossing my arms with finality. The debt was never really about the cash. It was about respect. It was about loyalty. You paid that debt the day you sat by my bed and held a cool cloth to my fever. Keep it.
He looked at the endorsed check, burying his face in his hands as he finally broke down, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief.
Later that afternoon, David and I drove out to the cemetery. We hadn't visited our father's grave together since the day of his funeral, nearly 9 years ago. We walked side by side through the manicured lawns, the spring breeze warm against our skin. When we reached the marble headstone, David didn't break down, and neither did I.
We stood together in comfortable silence, honoring the man who had given us life. David reached into his pocket and pulled out the old silver pocket watch I had returned to him years ago. He gently placed it at the base of the headstone. "I don't need it anymore, Dad," David whispered, his voice steady and calm. "I finally figured out how to be the man you wanted me to be. I'm taking care of her."
And she's taking care of me. I wrapped my arm around my brother's waist, resting my head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm tightly around my shoulders, pulling me close. We were no longer the frightened children running from our grief, nor the estranged siblings fighting over a broken legacy.
We were two adults who had survived the absolute worst of each other, emerging on the other side forged in honesty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. "Let's go home, David," I said softly, looking up at him. "Yeah," he smiled, kissing the top of my head. "Let's go home." We turned and walked away from the grave together. The past was finally buried, and the future belonged entirely to us.